Okay, so this is a story. This is a story about another clash. Think of the Homestead Strike, another clash between capital, the owners, and labour, the workers. So the subtitle is Harvest at Haymarket because things turned out to be even worse than anyone thought they were going to be. It all begins in this place, the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company in Chicago. When Cyrus Hall McCormick opened the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company in Chicago in the 1840s, he worked alongside his 23 employees. Of course, he knew them all by name. He cared about them. A few years later, the McCormick factory was making more than 1,000 reapers a year. Cyrus still knew all 200 of his workers. By 1884, the year Cyrus McCormick died, his plant was enormous. It covered 12 acres. 1,300 men worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week. 2 huge steam engines supplied power in the modern factory. That year, the company showed a profit of 71%, and McCormick no longer knew his workers. The thing that he produced in the Harvesting Machine Company in Chicago, and remember, Chicago is in the Midwest, and it's very close to the Great Plains. There are all these farmers moving to the Midwest, and they need something very helpful is the reaper, which is a machine that cuts down your corn or your wheat when it's all finished, ready for harvesting, and it lays it out in neat little rows. And here's another picture, another ad actually from the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company that shows how it works. And actually, I'm going to show you a little video of a modern video of one of these machines, and there's no motor, there's no electricity, there's no power other than the turning of the wheels. It's an ingenious machine, so let's watch it work. That noise you hear is not a motor, it's just the clanking parts of the machine as it works. And as it goes past us, we'll see what it's doing. Isn't that cool? Cuts it down, puts it in a little pile, just like in the picture. This thing was made in the 1880s and it still works. So these things were built to last, right? So this was the factory in Chicago in 1867, right? Quite a few people there. It's bigger than when it began, but this is the time when he knew all of his workers. By the time of our story, this is what the factory looks like. So it's way bigger, and it's got railroad running past it so that they can pick up all of the wonderful things that have been created by the factory. So this is typical of what was happening in America. Many of the new factories were owned by corporations, big business companies. The owners of the corporations sometimes didn't even live in the same town as their workers. Some of those owners got very rich, but refused to pay their workers a fair wage. They treated their workers as if they were commodities like coal or lumber. They seemed to forget that they were human beings. Steel workers had to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for little pay. Textile workers, many of them children like this child, worked 60 to 80 hours a week. They didn't go to school. Conditions were often dangerous. Miners worked underground with explosives but without safety regulations. In 1 year, 25,000 workers died on the job. Many more were injured. Child workers had 3 times as many accidents as adults. If a person lost an arm in a job accident, and many did with the new machines, no one helped with doctor's bills. If a worker complained, he was fired. So, as you know, workers organise themselves into unions to try and fight for better conditions and better pay. This is an Australian union, but I kind of liked it because I kind of like the flag, and they were showing unity with the United States workers. And of course, they have the thing, united we stand, divided we fall, which I've already mentioned to you. The union was like a club for workers. People who worked together tried to help each other to solve the problems they had in common. Sometimes they decided not to work unless they were paid better wages. In other words, they went on strike. Naturally, the owners, capital, hated strikes. They often fired anyone who joined a strike. Sometimes they hired police or soldiers to break a strike, as in the case of the Homestead strike. Sometimes strikers were shot, and we know that from the Homestead strike. Businessmen often took the law into their own hands. If they were powerful enough, they got away with it. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, who has an estate in Dutchess County and elsewhere, he was a railroad man who made so much money off of the railroads. He didn't think the law applied to him anymore because he was so rich he could go around it. He said, "Law, what do I care about law? Ain't I got the power?" He wasn't the only one who felt that way. Carnegie and Rockefeller hired their own police forces. Pinkertons. Workers began to demand their own power. The unions grew. Many Americans, especially new immigrants to the country, learned about democracy in the unions. Writer Upton Sinclair said the union was a miniature republic. Its affairs were every man's affairs, and every man had a real say about them. So what happens is you've got these two groups that become known as capital and labour. Labour we know as workers. Right? And we have people that work for the owners. We often call those management. That sometimes they can be the owners themselves. We have the capital, which is often means the owners of a factory, like Cyrus McCormick or Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller. And this is what they want. They want to keep labour costs low, and that helps them make more money, because if they don't spend so much on their workers, they make more profits. Revenue minus the costs equals the profit. So what you get paid for each thing you sell, minus how much it costs to make that thing, that's how much you make in profit. Labour, as we know, means workers. And what do labour want? Well, we know they want good wages, they want working conditions, they want to support their families, they want to do well. Workers and business owners, that is labour and capital, often had opposing interests. Workers wanted good wages, and owners wanted to keep their labour costs low. There wasn't much long-range thinking. With good wages, workers could buy the products the industrialists were making, and everyone would profit. Henry Ford actually made a lot of money from that, thinking about that very same thing. But early on, they were thinking about keeping labour costs low. Sometimes the relationship seemed like war. It was big business versus the unions. And because the situation was new, it was confusing. Many people distrusted unions, especially because some unions were organised by socialists. Socialists were people who wanted the government to take over the businesses that affected most citizens, like railroads, electrical power, telephones, steel. And of course, America had a tradition of individualism and private ownership. Socialism was really not very popular in the United States in the 19th century. Some unions were led by anarchists, and this is kind of what people thought of as anarchists. They're even more scary than socialists. They didn't believe in any government at all, which wasn't a very helpful idea. Although, some people disagreed. They said, if we had less government, maybe our society would be better. And this is something that comes up again and again. Some unions did abuse their growing power. Many strikes were poorly planned, hurt workers more than owners, but some business leaders just wanted capitalism, right? The invisible hand to work without any kind of regulations, no laws against anything that business owners did. And some got angry at the idea of workers having any rights and power. In 1884, soon after his father died, Cyrus McCormick II, so his son was called Cyrus, announced that he was cutting his workers' pay. Now, we've heard this story before, right? Andrew Carnegie did the same thing. Remember, his company, that Cyrus McCormick's company, made an enormous 71% profit this same year, 1884. A few months later, the workers went on strike. They stopped working. So think about the mistakes that Cyrus McCormick Jr. might have made while I tell you about the story. So McCormick hired other workmen to take their places. They were called strikebreakers, or scabs. Striking union men attacked the strikebreakers who were trying to take their jobs. McCormick hired armed guards. Sounds like the Pinkertons and Homestead all over again, right? A crowd captured and burned the guards' rifles. A police captain, who was on the side of the workers, did nothing. Chicago's mayor wouldn't help either, so McCormick finally agreed to go back to the old pay scale, so he gave in. And everyone went back to work and they got what they wanted. The strikebreakers went home. In a letter to her daughter, Mrs. Cyrus McCormick Sr. wrote about the strike. So this is Cyrus's mum. Hatred and fierce passions have been aroused, and an injury has resulted to our good name, the name of McCormick. It ended by our conceding the terms demanded. She doesn't sound too happy about it. But young Cyrus wasn't finished. The next year he installed expensive machinery that was designed to eliminate the most troublesome of the workers. At first the machines seemed to do just that. McCormick wrote his mother that the machines are working beyond our expectations. 2 men with one of these machines can do an average of about 3 days' work in one. But he didn't plan on machinery problems. The machines broke down. The parts they turned out weren't as good as the handmade parts. The cost to keep the machines operating was more than double the old labour cost. McCormick didn't care. He thought he had broken the union, and that seemed important to him now. But the union wasn't finished. Miles McPadden, a union leader, convinced McCormick's workers to join 2 national unions, the Metal Workers Union and the Knights of Labour. The workers went to McCormick, demanding higher pay and better working conditions. In the meantime, McCormick had been busy. He gave money to the mayor and the police. Yes, bribery. Then he closed his plant rather than meet the workers' demands. Again, sounds like Andrew Carnegie again. 400 city policemen protected the plant. Now they're on the side of capital, not labour. McCormick hired strikebreakers so the factory could start production again. Now he was in desperate need of workers, so he agreed to let the scabs work an 8-hour day, which was one of the major demands of the strikers. Naturally, that enraged the strikers. One day some strikers attacked a group of strikebreakers as they left work. Police started shooting. 2 men were killed and several wounded. And the next day, a mass meeting was called to protest the shootings at the McCormick factory. The meeting was held in Chicago's Haymarket Square. Most of the speakers were journalists and socialists and peaceful, although some of them suggested that working men should arm themselves. You notice this in 2 different languages because there are a lot of German speakers, so that's a German, the other language, and lots of German speakers in Chicago at this time. A lot of the workers in the factory were German speakers. So they held this meeting at Haymarket Square, and the meeting went, very peacefully, and the meeting was just about over, and everything was fine. When 180 policemen marched into the square and demanded the meeting be ended. There were only a few hundred people left, and the speaker was ready to go home. "We are peaceable," he said to the police chief, and climbed down from his platform. So you would have thought everything would be fine, but no, actually things got worse. Something unexpected happened. A bomb was thrown at the policemen. No one, I repeat, no one, has ever discovered who threw the bomb. 1 policeman was killed, 6 others died later of wounds. So, 7 policemen killed. Police began firing their guns. 4 civilians died. Many were wounded, and the nation was outraged. Most people were angry at the strikers. They seemed to believe that the union workers were all anarchists, bomb-throwing anarchists who were plotting to overthrow the government. Many Chicago workers were immigrants, German immigrants. Stories circulated about foreign conspiracies, as in, the Germans are trying to take over the country. The Chicago police rounded up suspects. They arrested people without warrants to do so, which, interferes with the 4th Amendment. Many Chicago workers were immigrants. Oh, sorry, I read the same thing again. 8 men were charged with conspiracy and murder. 4 of those men had left Haymarket Square before the bomb was thrown. One of them reported that there was not a syllable said about anarchism at the Haymarket meeting. It didn't matter. Fear was in the air. As someone said, anarchism was on trial. The nation was afraid of foreigners and socialists and anarchists. No one wanted to hear the truth. All 8 men were found guilty. 4 of them were hanged, and thanks to Harper's Weekly, we know what it looked like just before they were killed. 1 was sentenced to 15 years in jail. 2 had death sentences changed to life in prison. 1 committed suicide in prison, so there are only 4 left. At the McCormick factory, after this happened, the workers returned to a 10-hour day. One of the people who was hanged, August Spies, who was a German immigrant, said, "You may strangle me, but my silence will be more terrible than speech." And if we go back through the slides, I think there he is. There's August Spies, one of the people who was hanged. So these were the so-called anarchists of Chicago. That's the Haymarket Affair.